Jaspir Puar's terrorist assemblages is a critical intervention that examines how sexuality, nationalism, race, and terrorism intersect in the post 9/11 world. The book argues that queer subjects in the United States and other Western contexts are increasingly incorporated into nationalist projects through a process which Puar terms as homo nationalism. This process aligns certain normative gay and lesbian identities with the state, multicultural tolerance, and liberal democracy, while marking other bodies, particularly brown, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian bodies, as sexually perverse, terrorist, or incompatible with modernity. This incorporation of some queers into the fabric of the nation state occurs simultaneously with exclusion and pathologization of others, producing fresh hierarchies of belonging and exclusion. Puar begins by situating her work within the aftermath of September 11, 2001 and the War on Terror. In this period, sexuality became deeply entangled with questions of security, nationalism, and imperialism. For example, while Western nations celebrated the legalization of gay marriage and the recognition of gay rights, these very gains were mobilized to contrast the tolerant West with an intolerant Islamic world, thus justifying surveillance, war, and occupation. Queer subjects who conform to ideals of domesticity, consumerism, and visibility were invited into the national fold, while queerly racialized others, Muslim men at Abu Ghraib, Sikhs targeted after 9/11, immigrants detained under suspicion, were expelled, tortured, or marked for death. Puar uses assemblage theory drawn from Deleuze and Guattari. Assemblage allows her to move beyond static notions of identity politics and intersectionality to show how bodies, affects, discourses, and technologies come together contingently to produce categories like the terrorist or the homosexual citizen. Rather than treating these categories as stable, she shows how they are constantly shifting, unstable, and produced through relations of power. For instance, the figure of the terrorist is never purely racialized or religious. It is also sexualized. Terrorists are depicted as perverse, deviant, hypermasculine, yet emasculated, simultaneously homophobic and homoerotic. This sexual coding is not incidental, it is essential to how terrorism is represented and how national subjects are consolidated against it. In the chapter on Abu Ghraib, Puar analyzes the infamous photographs of US soldiers humiliating Iraqi prisoners. She argues that these scenes cannot be understood only in terms of military violence, but also be read through the lens of sexual exceptionalism. The photographs depict a perverse sexuality attributed to Muslims while simultaneously reinforcing the idea of the US as a sexually liberated, tolerant society. The torture becomes a site of sexual pedagogy. America is cast as modern, progressive, and tolerant of queers, while the Muslim other is cast as backward, repressed, and perverse. This logic stabilizes US nationalism even as it obscures the brutality of imperial violence. Similarly, in her reading of the Supreme Court case Lawrence versus Texas, which struck down sodomy laws in 2003, Puar shows how legal recognition of gay sexuality is structured around privacy, intimacy, and respectability. The decision frames the homosexual subject as a liberal citizen invested in property, stable relationships, and domestic life. However, this inclusion of queers into legal personhood is paralleled by the intensification of detention, deportation, and surveillance of racialized others. The right to intimacy is distributed unevenly, with queer subjects of color often denied access to it because of profiling, policing, and incarceration. In this way, rights and recognition for some are built upon the abjection and exclusion of others. Puar also explores queer diasporas, particularly South Asian and Muslim communities, to show how bodies are read and misread through racial and sexual lenses. Sikh men wearing turbans, for instance, are often mistaken for Muslim terrorists, and their masculinity is coded as patriarchal and threatening. Queer South Asians may attempt to distance themselves from these figures by aligning with US discourses of tolerance, but this alignment itself reinforces Islamic phobic and Orientalist narratives. Queerness becomes a site of regulation as much as resistance, capable of bolstering empire even as it seeks to change it. The term homo nationalism captures how some queer subjects are folded into nationalist projects not by erasing their difference but by normalizing it in ways that serve the state. Gay and lesbian rights, once seen as oppositional to the nation, become signs of its modernity and tolerance. Politicians and media celebrate the inclusion of gays as evidence of Western superiority, even as this very rhetoric is used to demonize Muslim societies and justify military intervention. In this way, queer rights are not only about liberation, they are also about surveillance, discipline, and complicity with imperial power. The book also emphasizes the role of affect, fear, shame, pride, desire in the production of terrorist and queer bodies. For example, the Pulse nightclub massacre in 2016 revealed the complexity of these assemblages. The shooter, Omar Martin, was both an employee of the security state and a racialized suspect under its gaze, both homophobic and possibly queer. His violence cannot be neatly categorized, and it demonstrates how queerness and terrorism are entangled in ways that destabilize stable identities. Throughout the book, Puar is critical of liberal narratives that frame queer rights as simple progress. She insists that recognition and inclusion always come at a cost, often borne by racialized immigrant or Muslim populations. Queerness is not inherently radical or resistant, it can also be regulatory, complicit, and protective of new normativities. This recognition unsettles easy binaries of oppressed versus liberated, progressive versus backward, resistant versus complicit.